Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Let me begin by thanking the Sharq Forum for organizing this wonderful event and for the kind invitation that I received. And I want to thank my brother Waddah and my sister Zainab, who is probably somewhere here, and all the unknown heroes behind the scenes for making this event happen. And I want to welcome all of you to Istanbul, those who have come from abroad, to talk about something that lies in the future. And I think the selection of the theme makes a lot of sense at a time when we go through many challenges and difficulties. But in the middle of all these challenging times, obviously, we need a vision for the future. But any understanding of the future also requires a proper understanding of the present and the past. And this is especially true for the Muslim world that has a long history of culture and civilization. I think one of the things that we forget in the modern world is how deep and penetrating our historical achievements have been. And we need to remember that. It's like in order to have branches that go up in the sky, you have to have deeper roots. And we have to recover our roots, obviously, to be able to survive in this world of chaos, disorder. A region in turmoil obviously refers by region, I guess we refer to the Muslim world in general, not just North Africa and the Middle East. So I will try to address the issue in that larger context and try to outline perhaps a few thoughts about what we can do to make our future better. Obviously, we live in a world of growing interdependencies where something happening in one part of the world affects many other things at the same time. We have moved from the world of snowball effect to what some scholars call the butterfly effect, where something happening somewhere in the universe having an immediate impact on a range of things happening in other parts of the world without maybe us realizing how subtle or delicate they might be. But we have to keep in mind this holistic approach, and I will come to that in the second part of my speech, why this holistic approach is so important, because the Islamic tradition in its religious as well as civilizational aspect is based on the idea of tawheed, unity. And we have to make this principle of faith also a principle of understanding life, existence, and politics, and how we will achieve that, I think, remains an important intellectual challenge for all of us. Now, we live in a world of power disequilibrium, where there is no really power balance between different actors. And the ground on which we try to survive in this world and try to make some good, obviously, is not fair. In the sense that this global imbalance of power assigns certain privileges to certain people or countries or actors, and creates a whole group of people either in a position of disadvantage or dispossession. And the sense of fairness or lack thereof, justice or injustice, in fact, basically emanates from this simple fact, that is, that we don't live in a world that is shared or shaped by principles of fairness. And you see this not only in terms of global politics, but also in terms of economic distribution, in terms of representation, in terms of expression of different cultural, civilizational, religious identities, in terms of social networking, and in many other areas. I think the fact that we have the social media, which gives us the sense that we are all equal and we can all represent ourselves, is somewhat illusory. In the real world, we know where power lies and who controls that power. And as long as we remain within this parameter of this power disequilibrium, I think we will continue to see the negative impacts of this global chaos and disorder on the Muslim world. Now, obviously, blaming others only for our own shortcomings is not going to solve any of our problems. As I've said before, and I think I said it here 2 years ago, it only leads us to intellectual laziness. Obviously, we have to look inside to identify our own weaknesses. What are the problems within our own souls, within our own societies? We have to address these issues in an honest manner, in an open, critical, self-critical manner. And when we look at this, first of all, obviously, some of the internal problems that come to our mind immediately are lack of unity at various levels in the widest sense of the term. lack of political unity, lack of unity in terms of our own social imaginations, lack of unity in terms of how we address ourselves, lack of unity in terms of how we even express ourselves. The words we use, the terminology we use to express, to describe our own state. If you look at all these areas in detail, you see there is this lack of unity, to which I will come again. A lack of vision. Who is putting out a vision for the Muslim world and globally for the world as a whole today? You see many Muslim countries that should be leading, in fact, the fight for justice, equality, and fairness in the world are dealing with problems of civil war, bad management or bad governance, economic inequality, and many other issues. So who is putting out a vision for the Muslim world there? I think it's a big question. Obviously, it's a challenge for this group of people also to think about. And then there is lack of leadership when it comes to the most important issues for our own people, for ordinary people, from the refugees, and we saw just a wonderful film about that, and just a very, very small episode from among probably millions of stories like this, from the refugees to the poor, from the oppressed to many other people, and the problems. Who is providing leadership for these people? Who is raising their voices for these people, whether it's Rakhine Muslims, whether it is the occupation of Palestine, whether it is ongoing fighting in Iraq, in Syria, the situation in Somalia, and the terrorism and all of that. Who is really providing leadership in all of these issues? One of the things that obviously we face today is what we might call a state of amnesia, where we forgot who we are, and we are trying to figure out who we want to be. In most cases, we've forgotten our own history, our own tradition. Middle East, for example, when you say even the word Middle East, which doesn't belong, by the way, obviously to our own terminology, because according to who or what, it is the Middle and the East, etc. It's a very Eurocentric terminology, but it has caught on, and we are stuck with it. We keep using it. Our classical geographers never called this part of the world, what we call today the Middle East. It was given different names. But anyway, what we call the Middle East today, when you even invoke the name, people immediately think of terrorism, poverty, corruption, bad governance, and things like that. But the same region produced culture and civilization, science and architecture, urban planning and prosperity for over 1,000 years. From Iraq to Syria, from Lebanon to Palestine, from Samarkand to Istanbul, from Andalusia to the rest of the Muslim world. We never think in terms of these great historical, cultural, civilizational achievements anymore. And we have to remember actually what made these achievements possible, because we all know in our hearts and minds that in fact we have the same roots and principles that made these achievements possible. And if we stick to them, if we hold on to those principles, we can revive the Islamic cultural and civilizational tradition again today in the 21st century. And we are trying to figure out who we are or who we want to be in an age of multiple identities, in an age of contest for multiple truths, in an age of interdependencies that put into question any absolutist claims to one single definition of culture or identity. We are all somehow connected or interconnected, but somehow we are also separated in so many different ways. What really unites us remains a big question here. And I think in terms of our own self-perception and our own search for an identity in the 21st century, these questions remain important. I refer to the external problems very briefly: interventions, civil wars, economic inequality, imperial power games. Obviously, these are things that you all know. I don't want to go over them because I want to really focus on what we can do collectively together in terms of our future vision. But I have to mention some of these issues here, to give you a full picture of the situation. The current global political and economic system doesn't produce justice. That's clear enough. That's why a number of world leaders have been calling for a reform of the UN Security Council, but not just that, but the entire global system. It's a Herculean task, no doubt. It's not easy, because none of the members of that is the permanent members of the Security Council wants to give up their privileges at the UN Security Council. But as long as the Security Council remains in the way it is functioning now, the whole UN system becomes dysfunctional. The UN becomes irrelevant, powerless in the face of the most pressing issues of the 21st century, when in fact it is the largest intergovernmental organization that is supposed to solve these issues. But as we have seen from the Syrian refugee crisis, to the Rakhine problem, to many other issues, nuclear proliferation and many other issues, the UN remains ineffective, dysfunctional, irrelevant. Why? Because the UN Security Council system, which was set up after the Second World War, doesn't really speak to the realities of today. That's why our president has been calling for a serious reform and revamping of the entire UN Security Council system. And he formulated it as the world is bigger than five. That is, the world cannot be just limited or seen through the eyes of these five permanent members of the world. But there is more to that, obviously. It's not just about, say, expanding the number of countries sitting at the National Security Council. It's more than that. It's really a call to change our understanding of politics, of culture, of international relations, of economics, change it in a way that will challenge the remnants of the Eurocentric understanding of politics and history. We are still living with the remnants of that Eurocentric understanding of world politics. Even in the Muslim world, which is supposed to actually address this issue in a critical manner, we have still internalized many of the concepts and ideas and notions of Eurocentrism. Just look at any history textbook. You will see that history somehow begins in the West. Philosophy, logic, science begins in ancient Greece, and everything flows from there. And all the other cultural, civilizational traditions, whether it's the Islamic tradition or the Chinese tradition or the Indian tradition, they become just footnotes to this flow of Western civilization. And this is how we have learned history. This is how we are, in fact, trying to make sense of the present reality on the basis of this very fallacious, one-sided, Eurocentric notion of history. And that applies to politics, obviously, today. When you talk about international relations, like who's setting the parameters, who is deciding on the basic rules and principles by which global politics functions today. And it's obviously the most powerful countries. There is one superpower, and then there are a number of great powers under it after the end of the Cold War, after the end of the bipolar world. So we live in this unipolar world where you have one superpower, and then a number of great powers like Russia, China, and India, and others. And then you have satellite of other countries. But when you look at this hierarchy, who set up this hierarchy? Where does its legitimacy come from? We need to question some of the fundamental structures of the current global system, so that then we can talk about working for justice, fairness, or for the common good of humanity. Therefore, we need a revamping of the global system as a whole. Now, I don't want to linger too much on this. There's much to say about this, and I think if I may suggest to the Sharq Forum, one of the things that I see a lot of young brothers and sisters here is really to look into this aspect of the current global system in a critical manner, produce work, challenge the system, challenge the perceptions, challenge the basic concepts, and do it in a very consistent manner. You cannot change the perception, you cannot change the notions, with one article, one talk, one book. It has to be done in a very systematic manner, over and over again, so that it is accepted universally, but more importantly, it begins to have some impact on how people think about these things and how people react to these issues. I mean, take the example of, again, I will refer to that, European reaction to the refugee crisis over the last 4 or 5 years. Europe, which is supposed to be the bastion of reason, rationality, enlightenment, science, humanism, has turned its back basically, and its cold back basically, to millions of refugees. And their attitude has been that as long as they don't come to our doors, they're not a problem for us. when they, show up in the streets of Europe, then they become a problem. We have to address it. That's why they came up with this Turkey-EU migration deal in 2015. But unfortunately, some of you may know the whole story. I don't want to burden you with that. They haven't really kept their promises even on that issue. We stopped the refugee flow from Turkey. Turkey hosts about 3.5 million refugees, about 3 million from Syria, but also from Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and many other places. And we will continue to host them as long as, we have the power to do it. As our president said, we will continue to implement the open door policy for all refugees, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or place of origin. They will come, and whatever piece of bread we have, we will share with them. But where are the powerful countries of the world? Where are those countries that claim to represent humanism, human dignity, multiculturalism, pluralism, all these nice words and values? When it comes to their implementation, what they mean in practice, they are just words, unfortunately. And we have seen this over and over again. And if you look at Europe today, for example, a lot of people see in Europe rise of extreme right movements, Islamophobia, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, old-fashioned racism. And you see the mainstream European politics moving more and more towards this far-right extreme politics. Who is going to stop that? Gone is the age of great European leaders like Charles de Gaulle, Winston Churchill, and others who could have given some direction to Europe. And what you see today is even in Germany, which is the most powerful country in Europe, its mainstream politics, as we have seen in the September 25th elections, has moved further to the right. And for the first time, you have a patently neo-Nazi political party, a racist political party represented in the German Bundestag. So this is the situation more or less in most of the major European countries. So we have to raise all these questions over and over again to register, what is really happening, and don't lose out, on the larger picture. So let me turn to the question of what to do then, if that's the situation in which we are, and what to do. First of all, I think the first thing is to wake up from our slumber. We've been in a long sleep for too long, and I'm referring to the Muslim world here. I'm referring to Muslim scholars, I'm referring to Muslim academics, NGOs, political leaders, students, youth, women, you name it. I think we have to wake up from this deep sleep. And we have to realize how serious the problem is. What we are going through today is a very critical period in our history. Not just in this country, in Turkey, not just in the Middle East, but in the entire Muslim world. In fact, in the entire world. 100 years from now, you never know what the world will be like, but you can predict what kind of calamities will come to this planet if you don't act now, if you don't take proper measures now. So we have to realize how serious the issue is and wake up and go beyond the images and the illusory image that, we are doing fine because I just, tweeted something wonderful this morning and I did my civic duty. It doesn't solve anything. I just gave a wonderful conference today. I'm referring to myself. So I feel good about myself. So I did my job. No. The matters before us are so serious. From the way we think, from the way we live, from the way we interact with other people, from the way we deal with political issues to all the other economic issues, whether it's in the Middle East, in Africa, or in Europe, or United States, or other places. Therefore, we need to wake up. We need to shake off this, I don't know what to call it, but this laziness, this slumber, this sluggish attitude, towards things, towards the world, towards things that are happening around us. We have to recover our own agency. We have to understand, again, that we are the agents of our actions. We have to be agents of our own future. We cannot let others decide our own future. I think we've done this for too long, and the situation or the result is clear. We have to take ownership of our own history. We have to take ownership of our own future. That's the only way, we can make a difference in this world, and that requires a lot of serious work, a lot of deep intellectual work, a lot of serious political work. It requires economic work, obviously. But it requires, as I said, a waking up in the first place from the slumber, from the deep sleep in which I think we've been for too long. We need a new vision. We need a new vision, obviously. We need to rediscover our own intellectual civilizational tradition. Without understanding what Al-Ghazali, what Al-Farabi, what Ibn Sina, what Ibn Taymiyyah, and many other luminaries of the Islamic intellectual and religious scholarship said, produced, we cannot understand the present and we cannot build a future. If we are going to address or respond to the challenges of, say, the Enlightenment or the post-Enlightenment intellectual thought in the West, from Kant to Descartes, from Descartes to Kant, from Heidegger to Wittgenstein, you name it, depending on your proclivities or your intellectual taste. We cannot address any of these challenges. We cannot respond to any of these intellectual challenges without first understanding our own intellectual tradition, what these great scholars, intellectuals, philosophers produced. And unfortunately, we are sleeping on a treasure that only some Orientalists have shown some interest in. And that's a sad fact. We have not even been able to produce critically edited and published our own works. I mean, we still don't have the great works of the Islamic tradition. Yes, there are some works here and there, piecemeal works done by some scholars, and we're all grateful to them for doing this. We all try to contribute, in our humble ways. But if you look at the overall picture, do you have access, for example, to the collected edition, a full version edition of some of the greatest scholars? It's like Ghazali, for example. You have to really go and search for it. A few books are published here, a few books are published here, and most of them are not really critically edited. Their Arabics have problems. They are not translated into other Islamic languages. Ibn Sina, Ibn Taymiyyah, Abu Hanifa, I don't know, again, you name it, Ibn Rushd, and many others. We have so many universities, research centers. What are they doing? We go to the West to get a good, critically edited version of these books. You have to go to Cambridge University, Harvard, and other places. I have no problem with that. I'm trained in one of them. That's not the issue. The issue is we are not doing enough to give our own tradition its due. And we have to really recover this intellectual tradition to understand, again, our past, to understand our present, and to build our future. It's like the dynamic relationship between the roots and the branches. The deeper the roots are, the higher the branches and the stronger the branches are. You cannot hope to have a flourishing big tree without strong roots, without feeding that root properly, without protecting those roots properly. Therefore, we have to pay more attention, to our own cultural tradition and history. It's like striking a balance between the center or an anchor point and having an open horizon. Obviously, we have to have an anchor point in this world of conflicting tendencies, growing interdependencies, huge, massive changes. If you don't have an anchor point at some point, we will be just going around depending on the waves and the winds that just come our way. We have to find an anchor point, but it doesn't mean that we close ourselves to the rest of the world. You have an anchor point so that we can have an open horizon also. We open ourselves to the rest of the world. That's how the Islamic revelation addresses itself when it says all humanity, not just all Muslims, but all humanity. And it addresses itself to whole humanity. And that's how classical Islamic civilization developed, when it incorporated many elements from pre-Islamic and non-Islamic sources, whether it was Greek or ancient Chinese or African or Indian traditions. They did this with self-confidence. They didn't think that it was going to change or color or taint their faith or their thinking. To the contrary, they all contributed, in fact, to the enrichment of that faith and intellectual tradition. So we have to have this open horizon perspective, but to do that, we have to have an anchor point. And I think it's clear where the anchor point needs to be. Again, it has to be our own tradition, the depth of our tradition, of our history. And that brings us obviously to the issue of the relationship between the self and the other. How are we going to relate ourselves, our own selves, to the rest of the world? What kind of a relationship we are going to set up between self and other? Do all others have to be our enemies? Does everybody have to be another person? When we hear the word other, obviously, immediately we think of negative connotations, because othering, turning those people who are not like us, into others, etc., obviously is not a proper reaction. But as long as we say we are, there are others who are not like us, obviously. So we have to find ways to manage the relationship between the two. We cannot just simply give up on our own selves in the name of some ruthless, wishy-washy global liberalism. I think even the 3 decades of globalization have shown very clearly that identities do matter. Collective memories do matter. Our own roots do matter. We cannot live without them. But we don't have to turn them into weapons with which, we deny the existence of others either. It's just a matter of how we manage the relationship, how we relate to those who are different from us, whether in terms of religion, in terms of culture, how we relate to these differences, and then how to manage those differences and perhaps create enrichment, cooperation, solidarity out of that relationship. We have to overcome Eurocentrism. I mentioned that very briefly, but also we have to overcome ethnocentrism. An alternative to Eurocentrism is not, say, a Turkish ethnocentrism or Arab ethnocentrism or Pakistani ethnocentrism. I think we have to overcome the centrisms to understand history properly, to understand the present properly. And that requires, obviously, widening our horizon, our perspectives on all the major issues. And that also requires reaching unity at all levels. If Islam is based upon the principles of Tawheed, divine unity, then it cannot be just at the level of faith. Tawheed or unity is not only an article of faith, it's also a principle of existence, thinking, ethics, morality. It is something that has to be lived and seen, in our lives. We have to reach this unity at the level of political leadership, intellectual journey, at the level of the hearts, at the level of our NGO work. What many scholars today call the holistic approach is nothing but an application of this principle of divine unity. But if we keep it at the level of just pure metaphysics, I think we will be missing out a lot on the meaning and application of Tawheed or divine unity to our lives. It has to be something that will penetrate our thinking, our ethical behavior, our politics, our daily lives, our cities, our understanding of aesthetics, architecture, art, and so on and so forth. In fact, when you go to any of the great monuments of Islamic tradition, you see this very clearly. The sense of unity, how everything comes together and gives you that sense of unity. When you look at the cities, etc. But today, obviously, we're far from that ideal. So therefore, we have to work for the unity of the minds and the hearts at the same time. We also have to develop a civilizational vision or civilizational approach, and remember the meaning of civility, what it means to be civilized, how we implement this in our daily dealings with different human beings, but also with the natural environment at a time when we are destroying it so much. We have to again think about civilization as a human habitat, where different human beings come together to create something good that is good for everyone. That's exactly what Ibn Khaldun tried to do with his what he called the Ilm al-Imran, that is the science of civilization, and how he defined the concept of asabiyya or group solidarity as a basis for creating and maintaining a civilization. We have lost our own asabiyya, our own group solidarity today in the Muslim world. What unites us, what keeps us together, remains a critical question, and we are still searching for it. I think some general ideas, some general principles do not help. We have to make them practical. We have to make them implementable in our lives today. And as many scholars, including Mullah Sadra, have said, those who cannot reach unity within their souls cannot grasp the unity of God. And if you are going to make a connection between the two, we have to start obviously from within. You know, if we are believers in the absolute unity of God, then we have to reach that unity within our own souls. And there is too much disunity, disorder, and chaos within our own souls. And that's the problem, because what is out there is only a reflection of what is inside. And we have to, again, look inside. In the middle of all these big political, economic, and social issues, really look inside to recover that sense of unity, that peace, that repose within our own souls. Otherwise, we will not be able to make any positive contributions to the world out there. Having said that, unity is not uniformity. Unity doesn't mean that we are all alike, we are all the same. No, unity is needed because we are all different. But we can walk upon the same path. We can talk to one another. You know, we can hold hands. We can defend, you know, our position, our cities, our families together, because we have all these differences. So unity doesn't mean uniformity. And multiplicity or plurality doesn't mean chaos and disorder. Yes, you have differences, but it doesn't mean that they will all lead to different paths, at the end of which they will fight with one another. It's really what Ibn Arabi called al-wahda fil kathra, that is unity within diversity. That's the kind of perspective we need today, to appreciate the differences, but do it from a point of view of unity that empowers the individual and our agencies rather than limits our freedoms. And we need to remember that in this age of competing truths, that's the only way we are going to have a say on the present and the future of the world. So let me end by a few remarks. All struggle obviously begin within our own souls. And we need that to deal with social political issues. It's just a matter of striking a balance between the two, between what is out there and what is inside, between zahir and batin, to use the two terms of the Islamic scholarly tradition. We have to recover our own agency. We have to be the agents of our own actions. We cannot just let others do things for us. We cannot let others think for us. We have to think for ourselves. Therefore, we need to develop our own intellectual abilities, our own intellectual capacities. And to do that, obviously, we need a wider horizon than just the immediate problems with which we have to deal on a daily basis. To address them properly and effectively, you need the larger picture. And my hope is that the way I've seen the Sharq Forum develop, grow, flourish, platforms like this will produce the kind of minds and hearts that will address these issues. To give you an example, we talk about institutions. Institutions are extremely important, no doubt. Scholarly institutions, research institutions, political institutions, they are all very important. But if you look at, for example, some of the greatest minds and political leaders of Islamic history, you cannot tell which school they graduated from. It's very hard. Ibn Sina did not graduate from a particular madrasa. He studied in many different madrasas. Ghazali became the president of the Nizamiya madrasa system, but he was trained again in many different circles. But the most important contributions he was able to make because he had his own close circles with his teachers. That's where they really studied things deeply. Therefore, circles like this are extremely important to produce new ideas, new visions, new leaderships that we need badly, so that we can address the issues in an intellectually satisfactory manner but also in a way that moves our hearts. It's not enough just to trigger our minds, but also we have to really think with our hearts as well. Because the world needs a combination of intellectual honesty and compassion, serious thinking, and reaching out to all of us, and to realize that if the Muslim world is to make a contribution to the rest of the world, it can only do so by placing itself in the world in the way it deserves to be placed. Thank you.
Speech with historical depth and philosophical width. We only will take only one question because of the pressure of time. Only one question will be taken, and after we'll be moving to the next session. The first one is the gentleman with green tie. But please, very short, 30 seconds.
Sorry, once again. So I just wanted to have your input on, to give advice to the youth that stands here today before you, what you would recommend them based on the information that you've provided us today. Thank you.
An excellent question, a topic for another lecture, I can say, but very briefly, work hard and take whatever you're doing seriously. Don't do it lightly. Whether you study a text or you are involved in NGO work, you travel, you network, whatever you're doing, social media, whatever, do it seriously. But again, I mean, to be serious about this, we have to have an in-depth understanding, of our own culture and civilization. I come back to that point again and again. Why? Because Newton said once that if I am a giant that changed history, that's because I stand on the shoulders of the giants. The Newtonian scientific revolution was possible because, he stood on the shoulders of so many others that came before him. So he kind of not only acknowledged, their contributions, but also he benefited from their work. He changed the course of history, and some of the things he said, he produced, were diametrically opposed to those people to whom he acknowledges his gratitude. But it doesn't change the fact that, he still benefited from them. For the Muslim youth, I think there is an added advantage because you can study the Islamic intellectual tradition and you can study the Western intellectual tradition. And that's a huge advantage that many people in the West don't have. And the combination of the two, will produce something that will go far beyond any national borders and boundaries. So I will suggest, studying these issues from a historical point of view, a larger historical, philosophical point of view. Spend time, with these great works of history, of culture, of philosophy, art, etc. All obviously with the sense that, so what do they all mean today? How can I bring them to the reality today? How can I make them living realities or living ideas today? Traditions begin to die when they stop asking questions like this. But they thrive when they develop different mechanisms to respond to the challenges that arise, as Toynbee said. Therefore, we are faced with many challenges. There's no doubt about that. But to address these issues, we have to develop some mechanisms by which we can respond to those challenges. As long as we have that capacity, that ability to respond to those challenges, I think we will be on the right track. And to do that, youth can do a lot, and they should do a lot, obviously. And And as someone who is now getting older, know the value of your young age.